A rider came out of the north in the gray before dawn, and Verna Ames knew before he reached the fort gate that someone was dying, because a man does not ride a horse to that lather for anything less. She was already awake. She was always awake before the bugle, boiling the officers' shirts in the lye steam behind the laundry shed where they had put her when they decided she was no longer fit to sleep inside the walls. She wiped her hands and watched the young Lakota rider argue with the gate sentry in the cold, watched the sentry level his rifle and jerk his chin back the way the rider had come, and she saw the young man's shoulders, not afraid, but desperate, which is a harder thing to look at. She had learned enough of the language in 3 years of trading soap and mending for hides at the edge of things to catch the shape of it. Their leader, a fever that would not break. The healers had done all they knew. He was asking for the fort surgeon, and the fort surgeon, she knew without being told, would not come. Verna had reason to know that. It was the fort surgeon, Major Pruitt, who had cast her out. A year passed, she had sat up 3 nights with a teamster the major had already pronounced dead of a crushed and rotting foot, and she had opened the wound the way her grandmother had taught her on the Tennessee frontier, and drawn out the black of it, and packed it with the pounded root she grew in a clay pot on her windowsill, and the teamster had walked again by spring. The major had not thanked her. A woman who healed what the surgeon buried was a woman who made the surgeon small, and small men do not forgive it. Within the month she was a laundress, then a laundress put outside the walls, and the fort had learned to call her the cast-out woman, and to cross the yard, rather than pass close to her shed. She thought of all of it in the time it took the young rider to wheel his horse and start back north, beaten, and then she did a thing that a wiser and more frightened woman would not have done. She took down the flour sack where she kept her grandmother's things, the little knife honed to a whisper, the dried coneflower root, the willow bark, the clean linen she boiled and let no one touch, and she walked out through the gate before the sentry thought to stop a laundress, and she followed the rider into the dark grass. He heard her mule behind him within a mile, and turned, hand going to the bow across his back, and found a plain woman in a gray dress with a flour sack in her lap, looking at him steady. "I heal," she said, in his tongue, badly, and touched her own chest, and then held up her hands. "I have seen the fever that will not break. Sometimes it can be broken. Let me try where the others have finished trying." The young man, his name was Hukala, though she would not learn it for a while, looked at her a long moment. He had ridden to the fort of the men who had taken so much, and been turned from the gate with a rifle, and now a woman those same men had thrown outside their own walls was offering the thing he had crossed the cold to beg for. He did not trust it. But his uncle was dying, and the healers had covered their faces, and hope, when a man is out of everything else, will make him trust a stranger. He turned his horse north, and she followed. The camp lay in a fold of the hills along a running creek, lodges pale in the last of the dark, dogs and horses, and the low grief sound of people who are waiting for a death. Verna felt every eye come to her as she rode in. A white woman, from the fort, unwelcome as a frost. An older woman with iron in her face, stepped in front of the mule and would not move, and said words Verna did not need translated. And Verna sat still and let herself be hated for a moment, because she understood it. She had brought them nothing but soap and grief before. Her people had. She could not fault them for the wall in the old woman's eyes. "I have not come to take," Verna said, slow, to the old woman, and set her flour sack down on her own knees and opened her empty hands. "I have come to give back one thing, if it is still there to give." The lodge she was brought to was warm and close, and thick with the smell of sage smoke and sickness. And the man on the robes was a big man gone gaunt, his broad chest laboring, and even burning with the fever. There was something in his stillness that told her at once who he was, and why a whole camp stood outside in the cold. His people called him Tahafchaska, white deer, and he had led them 40 years, through hunger and moving and hard councils with hard men, and he was not ready to leave them, and they were not ready to be left. She knelt. She did not touch him yet. She looked, the way her grandmother had taught her to look before ever the hands came into it, at the color under his eyes, at the wet rattle of his breath. At the leg the healers had wrapped in soft hide and packed with their own good medicine. Medicine she respected on sight, for the wound had been cleaned and tended by hands that knew their craft. But the leg was swollen tight and streaked dark up toward the hip, and when she bent close to it, she smelled the particular sweet rot she had smelled once before and never forgotten, on the teamster, and once before that, on her own husband. A blacksmith, dead in 4 days of a splinter of iron he had thought too small to trouble with. That was the thing the others did not know, because they had no reason to. Their medicine drew poison, and it was strong, and against most wounds it would have won. But she had lived among iron and forge scale and the small deep wounds men take from them, and she knew what their good medicine could not reach, that somewhere deep in that leg, something hard and foreign was still lodged, feeding the rot from the inside, and no poultice on the surface would ever draw it while it stayed. She lifted her head and found Hukala, and, behind him, the iron-faced old woman, who she would learn was Washte Wing, the chief's sister, and a healer herself, the one who had wrapped the leg so well. "There is metal in him," Verna said, and mimed it, a small hard thing, deep, and pointed to the streaked flesh. "Iron. From the fall. It is small. It is why the fever will not turn. It must come out, or the good medicine cannot win. I have taken such things out before. It is not gentle. But I would try, if he and you will let me." Washte Wing knelt across from her and studied the leg, and studied the strange plain woman, and Verna watched the healer in her weigh it against her own knowing, honestly, the way a true healer does, setting pride aside for the sake of the one on the robes. At last the old woman said something low to Hukala, and Hukala said, in careful trade words, "My aunt says she has felt a hardness there, and did not know its name. She says if you can name it, perhaps you can reach it. She will help you. She will not leave him alone with a stranger's hands." "I would not ask her to," Verna said, and meant it, and something eased half a degree in the old woman's iron face. It was White Deer himself who decided it. He had drifted up out of the fever at the sound of the strange voice, and he turned his head and looked at the fort woman with eyes that were tired past fear, and he spoke, and though she caught only a word of it, Hukala gave it to her whole. "He says, a life is a life, and he is not too proud to be saved by whatever hand the day sends. He says do what you have come to do. He says he sees you are not afraid of him, and he thanks you for that, for he has grown weary of being feared." Verna had heard a great deal said of the Lakota inside the fort walls, most of it ugly, none of it that. She looked at the dignified, dying man who had thanked her for not fearing him, and she felt something turn over in her that had been shut since her husband went into the ground, and she bent to her work. It was long, and it was hard, and it was not gentle as she had promised. She dulled his pain with what she had, and what Washte Wing brewed, and the two women worked over the leg together in the sage smoke light, the old healer's sure hands and the cast-out woman's small-honed knife, and near midday, Verna drew out from deep in the flesh a black, ugly splinter of iron, no longer than a thumbnail, a piece of a broken picket pin they would work out later. That had gone into him when his horse fell and rolled on the ice a fortnight gone, and she held it up in the light so all of them could see the smallness of the thing that had nearly taken their chief. And then she packed the cleaned wound with her grandmother's coneflower root and the good drawing medicine of Washte Wing together, the two healings laid in side by side, and she bound it clean. But the drawing out was not the end of the danger, and Verna knew it, and the hardest hours came after. Toward evening, the chief's breath went shallow and fast, the way a fire flares highest just before it gutters, and his skin went cold and gray, though the fever still burned beneath. And outside the lodge, Verna heard the sound of the camp change, heard the low keening begin at the edges of it, the sound a people make when they have decided a thing is lost. Hukala came to the lodge door with his grief already on his face. Washte Wing's hands trembled for the first time over her brother. Verna Ames had felt her own husband go in just this way, in just this cold gray flaring, and she had been helpless then, a young wife with no craft in her hands, and she had sworn over his grave she would never again stand empty-handed over a life she might have saved. She did not stand empty-handed now. She built the fire higher. She heated stones and packed them close about him under the robes. She got the willow bark tea, and washed a wing's strong brew down him a spoon at a time, through the long black middle of the night, the two women taking turns, neither sleeping, neither speaking of the keening outside. Near the coldest hour, Verna took the chief's big slack hand in both of hers, and bent close and said to him, low, in his own tongue as best she had it, that his people were at the door and not done needing him, and that she had not ridden into the cold and cut the iron out of him to let him slip away from stubbornness now. And whether he heard the words or only the voice, his breath, some time after, began to deepen. The fever broke that night. She felt it break under her hand near dawn, the killing heat going out of him like a tide turning, the dreadful sweet smell fading, his breath coming slower and deeper and easy, and Washte Wing, across the robes, felt it too. And the old woman lifted her iron face and looked at Verna Ames and did not smile. She was not a woman who smiled easily, but she reached across the sleeping chief and laid her worn hand over the white woman's worn hand, and held it, and that was worth more than a smile, and Verna knew it. White Deer woke clear-eyed on the second morning and asked for water and then for meat, and the camp that had been waiting for a death spilled out into the cold, laughing and weeping, and no one crossed the grass to get away from the fort woman now. She meant to go back. That was the thing. She was a laundress with a shed and a mule and a life, however small, and she had done what she came to do. But White Deer, mending, asked her to stay a few days to see the leg knit right, and Washte Wing, wordlessly, made a place for her at her own fire, and the days became a week, and Verna Ames found that outside the walls that had cast her out she was, for the first time in a long time, simply useful, and welcome, and seen. She sat many hours by White Deer as he mended, and he was a man worth sitting by. He had a slow, dry humor under the dignity, and a mind that turned things over honestly, and he asked her about her grandmother and her husband, and the iron that had killed him, and he listened as though her small, hard-worn life were a thing worth the hearing. He told her of his people, of the seasons of the hunt, of the councils he sat in that grew heavier every year as the fort and the wagons pressed closer, of a wife lost to the coughing sickness, and a son grown and gone to his own lodge, of the loneliness that sits on a man who must be strong for everyone and is allowed to lean on no one. And Verna, who had been allowed to lean on no one for years, found she understood that better than she had understood anything in a long while. "You could go back to the fort," he said to her one evening by the fire, in the trade words they had built between them, careful and slow and true. "They will want their shirts washed, or—" He looked at her across the low flames, unhurried, a man who had led 40 years, and knew the weight of the things he chose to say. "You could stay where a hand that heals is honored, and not thrown outside the wall. My sister would have you. My people would have you. I would have you, not to keep, for you are not a thing to be kept, only to be near, if being near me is something you would choose. You are free in this. You have been made unfree enough. I will not add to it." Verna Ames sat a long time with the fire on her face. She thought of the lye steam and the shed, and the crossed yard, and the name they called her by. She thought of the small, hard things she had drawn out of this good man, and of the old woman's worn hand over hers in the dark, and of being, here, not a cast-out thing, but a woman whose knowing had value and whose company was wanted. She thought of the word he had used, free, and of how carefully he had held it out to her, as though he knew exactly what it was to have it taken. "I have washed other people's linen for 3 years," she said, "to earn a place where no one wanted me. You are the first man in a long time who offered me a place, and then handed me the leaving of it in the same breath." Her voice was not quite steady. "I choose to stay, not because I have nowhere else, because there is nowhere else I would rather be." White Deer inclined his head, grave and glad at once, and did not reach for her, and that not reaching told her more than reaching could have, that he had meant every word of free, that whatever grew between them would grow because she watered it, and not because he willed it. It grew slowly, as the good things do. She learned the language past the trade words. She learned Washtef Wing's medicines, and taught her own in trade, the two healers making one deeper craft between them. She walked with White Deer, as his legs strengthened, at first leaning on her, then not needing to, and walking beside her anyway. His people, wary at the first, came one by one to bring her their sick and their hurt and, in time, their friendship, until the woman the fort had thrown out had more of a home outside its walls than she had ever owned within them. And on an evening in the tall summer grass, White Deer of the Lakota took the hand of Verna Ames, the cast-out woman who had known the one cure his healers did not, and he did not take it as a man takes a possession, but as a man takes an offered gift, holding it as though it might be withdrawn, and honoring it the more for that, and she left it in his hand freely. And the two of them stood in the wind off the northern plains, a chief and a healer, each of whom had carried a great loneliness a long way, and were at last not lonely, having each chosen the other, in the open, with both hands, and nothing owed, and nothing owned, only a bond freely given, and freely kept between two people the world had tried and failed to make small.